All right, well, we will get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Libby Murphy. I'm the Director of Policy at Minnesota Housing Partnership, and I want to welcome you here this morning and thank you for joining us for our legislative update call that we're having this morning, just to get an understanding of where we are in this session here in 2023 and kind of where we're headed and the status of everything housing related at the Capitol right now. So we do have a change in our agenda. Senator Port is not able to join us this morning. She had something come up, and so Senator Bolden may be joining us. She's the vice chair of the committee, as well as a member of the leadership team. And then Senator Zainab Mohammed will also be joining us. So we'll start. I will give an overview. And then Representative Mike Howard, who's the chair of the Housing Committee, will join us and tell us from his perspective about the House Housing Omnibus Bill and where things stand and how he's going to be going into conference committee. And then we will be hearing from Senator Zainab and possibly Senator Bolden. So when our guests arrive or while I'm talking, feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions. I especially encourage you, as Representative Howard, as well as the senators are on with us, that you use that chat feature to ask them any questions that you have related to their housing omnibus bills and kind of their position, both in leadership and on the housing committees. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen just to give a quick update on where we are at this point in session. So just quickly, we have had some early movement on bills this legislative session. At $50 million for the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, or FHPAP, was signed into law about 2 weeks ago. And so that money will go immediately to existing FHPAP providers and is intended to be used to prevent homelessness, prevent evictions, use as emergency rental assistance and other emergency aid to keep people safely housed. As a reminder, please mute yourselves. And I think, Brian, you should have the capability to do that too. So that's very exciting. As some of you may be aware, evictions are above pre-pandemic levels. Our new normal is higher than it was in pre-pandemic. So this money is absolutely critical to keeping people stably housed and preventing homelessness. So that's exciting that was able to pass before the end of session. Those resources are needed urgently. Another bill related to housing and homelessness support services and homelessness prevention was a bill called the Path to Home. That was moving quickly, and then it stalled in the Senate. And so my understanding is those things will be rolled up into an omnibus bill. But that's some of the work that was done early in session. And where we are right now. So several weeks ago, leadership announced joint budget targets. The housing committees were given $1 billion target to spend in addition to the existing budget at Minnesota Housing. So an additional $1 billion this legislative biennium. So this year, biennium 24 and 25, and then $50 million was added into what we call the tails, or added onto the base into the future. So it's a significant drop off from that historic $1 billion investment in housing, given the $17.5 billion surplus. And so I think our Chair Howard, I know, as well as the other senators who will be joining us, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge that they had in shaping their budgets, given that significant drop in investment into the tails or outgoing years. Both the Senate and the House omnibus housing bills have been heard in the housing committees. Both have been heard in the respective finance committees, finance in the Senate, Ways and Means in the House. The House bill had to go to taxes because there's a tax provision that needed to be heard in that committee. So it's made all of those stops. There's a tenant mini omnibus bill that was heard in the House and Senate housing committees, as well as judiciary committees earlier. And so that has been moving. They kind of extracted all of that policy and put it into one kind of what they call mini omnibus for tenant related policies. So where where we're going next is all of those bills, the housing omnibus bills from both the House and Senate, as well as that tenant mini omnibus bill, will be given floor votes. There'll be a floor hearing for both of those bills in both bodies. And then because the bills that are, the House bill is different than the Senate bill for both the tenant omnibus bill as well as the funding policy bill. Those will go into conference committee where members will negotiate their differences along with the administration. So the governor and Minnesota Housing will be involved in those conversations, and they'll have to sort out all of their differences, both on the spending front, as well as some of the policy changes that are being proposed in each of the bills. We have not seen this tax bills, and so we're waiting for those. We believe that both the House and the Senate tax bills will include provisions for housing. And so we're waiting to see what comes out of the tax committee. And then also the release of the capital investment bill. There was a capital investment bill or bonding bill that did make it, that passed the House and did not pass in the Senate. It did not receive what we call a supermajority. And so it failed. And so they're going to be revisiting that cash proposal, but that has not been released. So just, I'm going to go through some high level funding takeaways, and I can go in more depth too, if there's any questions on specifics or after our chairs and our senators present. But kind of the big takeaways from the House and Senate omnibus packages is they're putting in a significant amount in new production and preservation resources for multifamily, single family, as well as manufactured housing. And that I haven't calculated the breakdown between production and preservation, but more than half of the $1 billion in each of the House and Senate bills are going to new production and preservation. And the Senate looks higher because they're doing more bonding than the House. So that's why the Senate is getting closer to that 700 million, whereas the House is opting to put more of its ongoing funding into rental assistance. And so Chair Howard can talk about that, and I can get into that too in a future slide. But so that's where the bulk of the money is going to be spent, but then a significant amount, nearly 400 million in each of the bills is going to be going to things like rental assistance, helping people access home ownership opportunities. And so another significant amount is going into those types of programs. The House bill also includes dedicated revenue through a metro sales tax, and Chair Howard will be talking about that with more specifics. But that creates an additional stream of money that would be made available in the 7-county metro region. Roughly 300 million every 2 years would be generated from that metro sales tax, and that would go to a combination of rental assistance as well as county and local aid that could be used for production and preservation, as well as other assistance programs. So I'm going to go over the tails or the ongoing funding before going into the billion, because there's a lot of detail to go into that $1 billion. So I'm taking a little bit backwards, but I gave you the highlights of the billion. In the out years, the House is proposing to spend that 50 million budget target that it was given, the bulk of that to bring it home rental assistance. So that's a proposal for universal vouchers. It's not funded at scale, so those wouldn't be universal. And so they're working on figuring out how to target a significantly smaller amount of resources. For those of you who have been tracking that, to do universal vouchers cost $2 billion a year. So there's at a significantly reduced amount given the ongoing amount of spending that they were given in their target. And so 40 million is being proposed in the House, and then 2 million to Bridges, which is also a rental assistance program, and that's for people with mental health needs. And then the House is proposing to do a little more than 66 million in housing infrastructure bonds this year, and it has to pay for those bonds in the tail. So the debt service is covered in the ongoing spending. So it's proposing to spend 8 million to finance 66.6 million in housing infrastructure bonds. And then additional, it creates the metro sales tax, which would generate about 150 million annually for additional resource revenue in the 7-county metro area. And then the Senate, which also has that $50 million target, is proposing to spend 20 million on Bring It Home, and then is bonding more this year. So putting more in upfront production and preservation, but that will cost them $30 million in debt service in outgoing years. And this differs from the governor. The governor also has 30 million that they're spending on debt service to finance 250 million in housing infrastructure bonds. But then they spread out the rest of their ongoing funding across several programs, including 10 million for the Housing Trust Fund, which is rental assistance, 5 million to Homework Starts with Home, another rental assistance program, 10 million to Bridges, again, rental assistance, 8.5 million added to the base of the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance programs, then more emergency rental assistance and other homeless preventative supports, and then 8 million in the home ownership assistance funds. So that's kind of the key differences in how they plan on spending that 50 million ongoing additional money. So I talked a little bit about taxes. We haven't seen those bills, but there are some things that are in play that we do anticipate seeing in either the Senate or the House tax bill. So 40 tax relief. This would be creating a uniform and reduced tax rate for affordable housing. This we believe will show up in the Senate for both multifamily as well as community land trust properties. Will show up as a 0.25 uniform rate. And in the House, we anticipate there'll be we won't see the rate reduction on multifamily, but we will see community land trust added to that 4D tax status. And then the workforce home ownership program, there's been a proposal for several years now to capture the growth in the mortgage registry and deed taxes. That is still very much in play, and that is how the House has proposed to fund that program ongoing. So you don't see them appropriating money in the House to the workforce homeownership program because they hope to secure that revenue through the tax bill. But the governor and the Senate propose appropriating resources to that program. We know that the House has been working on a local and county housing aid program. It showed up in the tax bill last year. This is something that Chair Howard has been working on. He's indicated that he thinks there's a chance that that will be in the tax bill. There's a proposal to modify the mortgage interest deduction and remove second homes here in the state of Minnesota. That may show up in the House bill. And then in both the Senate and the House bills, we anticipate a modification to the renter's credit to make the renter's credit more accessible, automatic. Currently, there's a lot of renters who are not claiming the renter's credit because of the way that it's structured. And so this would make it so that all renters who are eligible are actually receiving the credit. Michael, I think you've tracked that more. If you have any more details and you want to put that in the chat, that would be appreciated. And then there is a proposal to tax short-term rentals and use that revenue to finance some single-family home ownership types of activities. And so that may still be in play in the tax committee. And then on the tenant mini omnibus bill that I mentioned earlier, again, so all the tenant-related pieces have come out of the housing omnibus bill, and it's a separate policy bill. And the reason for this is that a lot of these policies had to go to the Judiciary Committee, and so everything that had to go to Judiciary was kind of taken out, put into its own bill. The things that MHP has been tracking has been source of income protections. This is still in the House. It was amended out of the Senate in Judiciary, so it was still in the House when it went through the Housing Committee, and it has been amended out. So because it is in the House bill, it will show up in conference committee. It has also been a priority for the governor. So we are hoping that the governor and the House stay strong on that position as they go into conference committee and So it's kind of unknown what's going to happen in conference committee around source of income protections, which is making sure that people who do receive some type of rental assistance are actually able to use it and aren't discriminated against because they're using a voucher or any other type of public assistance to help them pay rent. Eviction expungement, that is included in the bill, and Michael Dahl, if we have time, I might turn it over to Michael just to answer some questions through the end of the program on some of the tenant mini omnibus bill provisions. But that is included, as well as a 14-day notice for evictions is included. And those are some of the highlights that MHP has been tracking in that bill. There's a lot more in that bill. And again, if we have time, we can turn it over to Michael Dahl, who's the expert on that front. So I'm going to now turn it over to Chair Howard. And again, I can go into greater detail on the funding, but after I want to make sure that we have time for our lawmakers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. So Chair Howard, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Hi there. Glad to be here.
So I'm just going to turn it over to you if you want to give a quick overview of your housing omnibus bill. And then, as I had said in the beginning, please put your questions for Chair Howard in the chat. And I will make sure that we get as many of those answered by Chair Howard.
Yeah, I'll give a quick overview and leave as much time as we can for questions. But just to say that it's an exciting time. We're poised to pass our boldest housing package that this legislature has ever considered. In some ways, it'll be the first significant commitment of resources that the House, the legislature has ever made to address our housing crisis. And so it's an exciting time. As I caught the last half of Libby's presentation, so I won't go through kind of line item by line item, but we have the ability to make within the budget targets in this surplus $1 billion in one-time investments in housing, and beyond that number will be benefits across the housing continuum that will create a better life for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans. And so our committee really took the approach of recognizing the depth of the housing crisis requires us to make investments at sort of every level of the housing continuum, from preventing homelessness up to pathways to home ownership. And our bill really reflects that. A few things that I'm really excited about, specifically making our state's first commitment in the area of state-based rental vouchers, the Bring It Home program that I've been authoring, and there's been so much amazing organizing around for many years. We take an approach to use a lot of our one-time dollars to get this program started. And then we also use dollars and revenues through the Metro-wide sales tax, which I'll talk more about, to provide it in combination more than 6,000 vouchers to low-income families all across the state, which is just game-changing, life-changing resources for low-income families. And my hope is that at an investment level like this, we can show the virtues of a program like this and keep us on a path to make longer term investments to create a state where everyone has housing stability. In the area of building homes, I mean, that's really at the core of how we address the rising rents and rising home prices. We need to build a lot more homes. And so that is a huge focus in this bill through our housing infrastructure bonds, and a mix of both proven programs like the Challenge program and looking at new programs and new investments. That's the other thing I would mention in general that our approach takes, is recognizing that if we're going to address our housing crisis, we can't just do things the way we've always been doing them. There's a lot of new and innovative programs within our House finance budget, within the Senate finance budget, and those will be priorities for us moving forward, because we need to be expanding our horizons and thinking outside the box. This is the most ambitious housing bill ever before us to address our home ownership equity gaps. In particular, I wanted to highlight Representative Hassan's bill, home ownership investment grants, a new and innovative program to create on the production side, more homes that are affordable. And our Vice Chair, Esther Agbaje's first generation down payment assistance has a significant investment that will create pathways for more than 4,000 new first generation homeowners. We also make our state's first commitment to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, which is something that I've been banging the drum on every year. I've been at the legislature, and it's exciting to be on the precipice of doing something really significant there. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, we cannot, even $1 billion is fantastic. We're going to do so much good with $1 billion. But the reality is, since we've never truly invested as a state in our housing crisis, we are not going to solve our housing crisis with a $1 billion one-time investment. We need to be creating a path into the future if we're truly going to wrap our arms around this. And we only have a $50 million TAILS target, or an ongoing investment target. That's not enough. That's not going to cut it. And what I would say is, in this budget environment, if there isn't sort of the will to make long-term investments through general fund dollars, I don't think there ever will be. And it's time for us to think outside the box and bring in new dedicated revenue sources. And so that's why we have proposed a 1/4-cent metro-wide sales tax that would raise between $150 and $200 million per year. That revenue source would be ongoing and would help us both on the production side and on the housing stability side. How that would work is we would deliver 3/4 of those resources directly to cities and counties so that they can invest in a flexible use of affordable housing challenges in their communities. We estimate that'll help us produce an estimated 1,000 new affordable rental units and 1,000 new affordable homeownership units per year. And in addition, we would fund 3,000 housing vouchers in the 7-county metro area with those resources as well. And so it's a critical component of our budget to address our ongoing needs. And it's one that continues to pick up momentum by the day. I've had a lot of really great conversations with advocates, with members, with local elected officials in the 7-county metro area that see this as an exciting new tool that is so desperately needed. And so it's kind of a yes and budget. We're going to address our short-term needs, our long-term needs, and address our challenges all across the housing continuum. It's an exciting time, and we're going to keep pushing forward until we get across the finish line. And with that, I'll stop. I'll look at the chat here and take up some questions. Or Libby, do you want to facilitate? Maybe that might work better.
Yeah, I can do that. So in the chat, we have a question about carve-outs in the Senate. So the Senate bill does include a lot of carve-outs. It's a little harder to read that spreadsheet and figure out how the House and Senate are actually lining up. But can you talk about that going into conference committee and how you're going to approach that with the Senate?
Yeah, and so a little background. The housing budget hasn't traditionally done line item carve-outs for specific organizations or specific organizations. Part of that has been by virtue is like there hasn't been nearly enough funding to do that. In total, the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency budget is something in the tune of $150 million, or 0.4% of our state budget. This year, we will have significantly more resources, one-time resources, and so there is, I think, a little greater appetite to think about specific line items for specific organizations doing amazing, great work. We did take the approach in the House that we think it's probably the best path to fund programs, quality programs, and make this large resource available to these to organizations, whether it be homeownership investment grants or challenge program, capacity building grants, which is a pot of resources that's really never adequately been funded, but will have $8 million in our budget. And the Senate took a different approach. They included kind of sub targets for many specific organizations. I would say, from my perspective, I'm open to the conversation. I'm most interested in the end point, in making sure that we're adequately funding the entities that are on the ground doing the important work in our communities. And I think there's a couple different ways to get there that could involve, standalone carve-outs, or could involve making sure that we set up programs that are accessible to organizations, including organizations that kind of have been shut out in the past.
You're muted, Libby.
Well, I think you're muted, Libby.
Thank you. So another question in the chat was talking about the types of land that can be developed. Are there any environmental considerations in the bill for the type of land that can be developed with this significant increase in resources that are now available?
I don't know that there's anything specific in the bill related to land use. What I would say is that I'm hopeful. We did hold a hearing for the first time this year in the Housing Committee on a pretty significant land use zoning reform bill. I'm hopeful that in our policy year next year and throughout the interim, we can really dig in for the first time. I'm convinced that the state needs to have a larger role in this discussion, and that there is fruit in addressing our affordable housing crisis by the state really thinking long and hard about how do we do development. And it's a good question. If we're going to inject a lot of new resources, we should pair that with really thoughtful planning. And the state hasn't really historically had a large role in that. And I think it's time for us to have a larger role in it.
Thanks. So the Metro versus a statewide approach to dedicated funding. Can you talk a little bit about the rationale going into creating your omnibus bill as to why a Metro-based sales tax versus a statewide sales tax?
It's a really good question. Clearly, we have statewide challenges in housing. And I think in total, our bill addresses that and has some ways to address specific needs all across the state. In the local housing aid bill that you mentioned in the tax bill, in some sense, I think is our opportunity to provide dedicated resources statewide. In terms of why to propose a 1/4 cent Metro-wide sales tax, a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a little bit more of a socialized idea. There's been ongoing conversations about it this session, and there's precedent and support in the legislature to pass Metro-wide sales taxes. And the other piece I would mention, in particular, if we're going to address the supply-demand mismatch for our deeply affordable housing, 70% of that gap is in the 7-county metro area. And so in some sense, it's a combination of this tool being a little bit more ready for the discussion at the legislature at the 7-county metro area, and that's where some of the needs are the most acute. That said, I do think we need to continue to have the conversation and have as many irons in the fire as possible this session and going forward to address the statewide needs, because of course we have a housing crisis border to border.
Thanks. And I just want to, so Kim in the chat has some comments about discussing accessibility in housing. But I just wanted to make a comment about the constitutional amendment statewide sales tax effort that MHP is working on. That is unique from what Chair Howard is proposing in the House Housing Omnibus Bill, in that we create what we're calling like resident councils to oversee 3 unique funds. It's more like the legacy amendment, and that it creates some separate funds and has these citizen or resident councils. And included in those councils is the requirement that there are people with disabilities, lived experience, who sit at those tables and help influence the decision making, or are the decision makers in making recommendations to the legislature on how those funds would be spent, and then also making policy recommendations. So I just wanted to call that out, that is a part of an effort that is happening at the Capitol right now. And that there were some in the bonding, the housing infrastructure bond policy changes. There are some changes made to make sure that housing infrastructure bonds are building more both physical as well as sensory accessible units. So let's see, there's some others. One of the things that I wanted to make sure to ask about is just given the balance of power with the trifecta, we know amazing things are happening and have happened, but what does that mean in conference committee? You and Senator Port's bills are more aligned than your bill, than how you're aligned with the governor right now. And a lot of that is both of your bills propose creating several new programs, and the governor's budget, I think there's just a handful of new programs. But can you talk about that and kind of the role that the governor's office will play and Minnesota Housing will play in negotiating?
Yeah, I am really looking forward to a conference committee and negotiation that's going to look miles and miles different than the ones that we've had over the last 4 years. And I do think in general, there's a ton of alignment between Senator Port, myself, and the governor's office and Minnesota Housing, especially around our values and the kinds of priorities we want to move forward with this session. So I feel really optimistic about where we can end up. You kind of referenced this, to the extent there's tension, I think it is in, focusing on existing programs and initiatives versus new initiatives. And I do think Senator Port and I are aligned in thinking that now is the time for us to expand our horizons and to kind of reject status quo thinking. Minnesota Housing, as it was envisioned, was at the beginning was really a bank, right? And not a really multifaceted, multifunction entity to address our housing crisis. And I think now is the time to expand and create more muscle at Minnesota Housing to address the growing and deepening challenges in housing. And so I'm really committed to it. The other thing I would say is we don't want to put Minnesota Housing in a place where they're not able to implement or succeed. That's part of the important conversation about making sure we're providing the resources so that they can be successful in implementing those programs. But I'm really confident we can do that. We have the resources. We have legislators and community members and advocates that have presented incredible, well thought out ideas that have been around for years. So it really is the time and the moment to be in yes and mode and invest in our proven programs and create new ones.
Thanks for that. So there is a question about people involved in children protective services and housing vouchers and people with criminal backgrounds and access to vouchers. So I just want to ask you about how you're thinking, because Bring It Home is not going to be funded at the level to make them universal, how you are thinking about targeting the program and how you're working with the Bring It Home Coalition and others to think about scaling down that program and how you're thinking about targeting the limited number of vouchers that there were, significantly more, but still limited number of vouchers.
Yes, great question. And it's an ongoing conversation. And so, for some context, right now, there's about 200,000 Minnesotans that qualify for a Section 8 voucher that aren't receiving one. To fully realize the Bring It Home bill, we would cover everybody. Those are folks at 50% AMI or below that are cost burdened with their housing. And the combination of the resources in general fund dollars and the Metro-wide sales tax would allow us to fund, roughly 7,000 housing vouchers. So that gives you a sense of the total need versus what we're able to address. We've had conversations about relying on our public housing authorities to sort of target, which they are currently doing in many ways already in terms of how they deploy those resources. Something we've talked about is, should we, really focus at 30% AMI or below, which is such an important metric when you look at folks that enter homelessness? Should we focus on families with children and try to do our work to put us on a path to end children's homelessness? And so those are ongoing conversations and genuinely open to feedback about how best to do that. But we are going to have to target. And my hope is that by targeting and showing some success in this program, we can build towards the future and move us closer to a state where we're meeting the full need.
Thanks. And just Ruth, just to your comments, there are conversations among members of the Bring It Home Coalition about how this interacts with Section 8, and if Bring It Home is more targeted, what does that mean if you've been on a waiting list for a Section 8 voucher, but somebody who's more qualified under the Bring It Home targeting, like how does all of that work? That is still very much in conversation. One thing I just wanted to ask you, Representative Howard, is that you're taking a little bit of a risk on bonding, choosing to bond less this year, hoping that there'll be a significant bonding bill next year and that we'll get more bonding resources. But can you talk about that calculus? And just as a reminder to folks, traditionally, the even numbered year, so 2024 is a bonding year. And so hence kind of this calculus that Representative Howard, I think that you've made.
Yeah, so with our limited ongoing resource target of $50 million, you know, the proposal that advocates brought forward for housing infrastructure bonds, my bill that I authored included $750 million in housing infrastructure bonds. At that level, basically if we were to put housing infrastructure bonds at anything close to that level, it would basically take up the entire TAILS target of $50 million. I believe the math is if we did a 400 million HIB bill, that would take up the full $50 million target. We made the decision in consultation with a lot of our legislators and advocates that we wanted to focus on bringing new dollars to new programming with those resources, knowing that we may have more opportunity next year and beyond to fund housing infrastructure bonds. Or even in a bonding bill this year. There's a little bit more opportunity and paths for HIBs as we think about in an ongoing way, but we didn't want to pass up the opportunity with our limited $50 million to use that, deploy that in a way that's going to have an ongoing benefit. And we're choosing to focus a lot of that on the housing voucher conversation.
Sure, Howard, I just want to double check with you if you have time for another question or two.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and I know that, so as an update, Senator Zainab Mohammed was pulled back into Finance Committee, so they recessed and then she got pulled back, so she will not be able to join us. And I still have not heard from Senator Bolden. She was kind of case dependent on the ending of another meeting, but so one of the earlier questions was about the American Rescue Plan resources. And I know that you were engaged in a lot of conversations with Minnesota Housing at the beginning of session about the 75 or 85 million that they have in reallocated resources from the American Rescue Plan. Are you still in conversation, or what is the plan moving forward to ensure, or kind of what role the legislature will have in monitoring those resources?
Great question. And sort of related, and I might have missed this if you covered this already, but you know, the legislature has already approved $50 million in rental assistance through FHPAP that's been signed by the governor. And that's exciting, and due to a lot of the advocacy of the folks on this call. So thank you. As the conversation has developed with Minnesota Housing, we hope that in the rental assistance conversation, we see the $50 million we're going to deploy through FHPAP coming sooner in the matter of months, hopefully weeks or months, to the entities delivering rental assistance all across the state. Coming after that, in a complementing fashion, we hope that Minnesota Housing will be deploying this year the ERA dollars. And there's some differences with sort of populations that can access those resources. So we're having conversations to make sure that, you know, the right hand knows what the left hand's doing, and that, you know, in total, these resources can be deployed in an efficient, effective way for our communities. I don't have a specific timing pieces, but those are things that I think we want to continue to be in discussion with the agency, knowing that the needs are so present and current, and every day, you know, we're not able to deploy resources is a day that folks are falling through the cracks.
Well, I'll go back to Kim's question related to accessibility and just, I think Health and Human Services has kind of typically had more oversight of housing needs for people living with disabilities, but I would personally, I would say they're failing in making sure that people who need more accessible housing and that's transit oriented are actually able to access that housing. So what kind of conversations have you had? Are you planning on having, because next year you're going to be in session and there's could be a supplemental budget next year or additional surplus as well as policy changes. So you can talk a little bit about what role your committee has in addressing accessibility needs for people living with disabilities, as well as kind of people aging in place and their caregivers.
It's a great question, and definitely one where it feels like we've just sort of scratched the surface. And in so many ways, it's one where we're behind the curve, and that's an understatement. As you mentioned, in our housing infrastructure bond language, we have new language that we've worked in concert with ARC Minnesota and some really great disability advocates that have been at the Capitol testifying in support of ensuring if we're going to build and put a huge new influx of resources into our housing, we need to make sure we're building more accessible housing because we of course have a huge shortage of affordable housing, but it's magnified times 10 when you think about affordable, accessible housing. And so I think our committee has a role to build more accessible housing and make sure that we have the policies in place in tandem with their funding streams. But I think we need, where I hope we can do more work over the interim, is sort of getting out of our silos and where can we sort of partner with the service side of the equation and make sure that folks have access to housing that's affordable. And so I feel that's definitely where we have more work to do.
Well, Chair Howard, I just want to thank you so much for taking so much time with us this morning. It's been very informative, and I suggest that you read the comments because there's been some praises sung to you in the comments as well. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. So again, Senator Mohammed is not able to join us this morning, and I don't know about Senator Bolden. So I'm going to pivot. I had asked Michael Dahl if he would be willing to give a little bit more overview of the tenant omnibus bill that's moving forward. I gave some really high level things that MHP has been watching, but Michael knows the tenant omnibus bill kind of inside and out. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to just tell us a little bit more about what's in that bill.
Sure, and thanks, Libby, for setting aside time to do this. I realize it came out of not having some legislators here, but I appreciate this opportunity. I do want to quickly just well, first of all, say that it could be as early as next Wednesday that we could have tenant rights omnibus bill heard in the House, and so we need a bunch of people expressing enthusiasm for the strongest bill possible on the many things that are in the omnibus bill, or the minibus bill, as Annie Shapiro coined it just last week. And so looking at that, there are a bunch of changes that are happening, and dozens of things that are happening that are very pro-tenant changes, and we really need this actually, because there hasn't been a hard look at what our tenant landlord policy should be for decades. And I often say that it was when Germany still had a wall going through it to make it east and west. It was like 1989 since the last really big changes that happened in tenant landlord law, and things have changed. And we need law changes to reflect the fact that rental market has changed and people in need has changed as well. I will talk a little bit about sort of a longer list of things that are in the bill, but I want to focus first on the three transformational things that I really see in the bill and what that means regarding action that we need folks to take after this presentation. The first thing is that there is a pre-eviction notice of 14 days that a landlord needs to provide a tenant prior to filing an eviction action. Eviction action is simply the landlord saying that they want to take the tenant to court because of some reason. Usually it's non-payment of rent. And it's a burden on landlords. It's a burden on tenants, obviously, but it's a burden on landlords to file this thing. It's a $300, $300 to $400 charge for that to happen. And so we think it makes sense to just, have the tenant and the landlord try to work out something amicably. And that can be done if there is a pre-eviction notice that gives them time to sort of work out. Maybe there's a deal that can be worked out as a payment plan. Perhaps, someone has the money, they just, forgot to pay and they need a chance to do that. And then there are times where a tenant is just going to have to find a more affordable place to live. And all of that can be done if there's the space to actually allow for something like that to happen. And a pre-eviction notice provides that space. I should say that we're one of only like 4 states that don't have a pre-eviction notice of some level. And so we're really behind the times on this and want to provide that opportunity. The last thing that I'll comment about this is that a pre-eviction notice would actually become the indicator that there's an emergency, that a tenant needs help and needs help applying for financial assistance at the county level. And so providing that pre-eviction notice helps begin that process. And that can also be helpful in getting the landlord to see that a tenant is doing all they can to try to retain their home, but also make good on the fact that they haven't been able to pay rent. A 14-day notice is the bare minimum that we need. And so one thing that I want to point out regarding the 3 transformational things, which are pre-eviction notice, expungement reform, and source of income protections, is that we don't want the House or Senate to retreat from the positions that they're currently at. And so as a first message to legislators is to say, we need the strongest bill possible. And for pre-eviction notice, we're saying 14 days is really where is the minimum that we need. The second issue is expungement reform. And there's a number of things in expungement reform. The first is that something shouldn't go on someone's record until the judge has actually ruled for the landlord. And that provides, again, the space to work out a deal with the tenant and the landlord without something appear on their record. We actually at Homeline receive calls quite frequently where someone has paid up, the landlord said everything's good, but it's after they filed an eviction on their record. An eviction action on their record and said, hey, I want to take you to court. And then after that, there's been resolution. Well, that public record is still there and it can prevent someone from renting in the future. And then I think I also want to mention that after 3 years, there would be the eviction or the eviction action would fall off of someone's record so that this wouldn't haunt them forever. And right now we're having evictions haunt people forever because it's in the court database and anybody can actually look that up and find out about your rental history. And the last point I want to make, and again, I want to say on this one is that we don't want the House or Senate to retreat from a 3-year position to something less than that. I'm sorry, more than that. So that where they'd have to wait 5 years or 7 years. And then the last transformational change that I really point out in the tenant landlord law legislation is that there'd be a source of income protection saying that landlords couldn't discriminate against someone based on their receipt of a subsidy. And the House has that in its bill. There are a couple of things that water it down so that they don't have to be used with smaller landlords. It's currently not in the House proposal. I'm sorry, the Senate proposal, but we're hoping that we can get it back before conference committee so there can be a position of strength on all those issues. And I wanted to focus on those 3 first, and then
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
That was an incredibly helpful more detailed overview. It was very detailed and I really appreciate it, but I am going to interrupt you because Senator Bolden is able to join us for these last 10 minutes. But if anybody has additional questions about what is additionally in the tenant omnibus bill, please reach out to Michael Dahl. I don't know if Michael, you want to put your email in the chat, or you can also reach out to me and I can help facilitate those questions as well. But Michael has been kind of tracking that bill in greater detail for both Homeline as well as the Homes for All Coalition. So I'm going to pivot right now to Senator Bolden, who's able to join us for these last 9 minutes. But thank you, Senator Bolden, for joining us and helping us understand how the Senate is going to be going into conference committee and the positions that you'll be holding on to most firmly, and how you anticipate working with the governor as well as the House and negotiating the final omnibus bill package.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite. Apologies that it was a bit last minute, so I had another meeting, then I couldn't leave quite as early as I'd hoped to. So anyway, very happy to be with you for these last few minutes. So I will just share, in working with Chair Port, we are really proud of this omnibus bill. It's $1 billion investment, a historic investment into housing, which, as we all know, is greatly needed. We have been in very close contact throughout session with Chair Howard and Vice Chair Agbaje in the House, and there are many similarities in our bills. However, they're not exactly the same, obviously. So there will be a conference committee to work out those differences. I will say on the Senate side, we have been, and Chair Port has been, very intentional about including sort of 3 buckets, or focusing on 3 buckets in the bill. One is rental assistance, one is supply, just the supply of homes and units, and then the third is homeownership. So there's those 3 pieces are the focus of the bill. And I don't know if somebody has walked through the bill already, but I can do that a little bit. So there are provisions for first generation home buyers assistance. So there's $176 million in one-time funding for that. There, of course, is we passed already $50 million in rental assistance, but there's more investments in rental assistance in the bill as well. There's investments in unit creation. There's housing infrastructure bonds, the Home Coalition bill that funds $100 million in grants to NOAA construction and rehabilitation. There's opportunities to level the playing field for opportunities to purchase manufactured home communities. There's really investments in programs that we know work. It just is a matter of making those investments and having the funds and the dollars available to make those programs work. So I'll be sort of brief in case there's questions, but the strategy really is to work in collaboration with the House and the governor to get as much done as we can. As you probably know, really nearly all of that $1 billion is one-time money versus ongoing money. So that sort of, it presents a challenge as far as, what can be done in terms of not having those ongoing funds, which we need. And there are ongoing conversations about securing dedicated funding for housing. We have not finalized anything with that yet, but there are ongoing conversations, but using the one-time money we have, leveraging it, as best as we can to make those bold investments.
Well, be great to hear a little bit more about some of the ongoing conversations about dedicated revenue. And if there is a path forward in the Senate, we know that Senator Port and you and the rest of the committee members tried to put the Metro sales tax in your omnibus bill, but had to pull it out because of opposition in the tax committee. Have those conversations progressed? Is there a path forward?
Yes, those conversations have progressed. There still is some opposition in the tax committee. There's been conversations about sort of the level of that tax, whether it's, 3/4 of a cent, half a cent, 1/4 of a cent. So nothing has been finalized with that. I'll just be transparent. It's an uphill path for that, given the opposition we've seen in the tax committee, but we're not letting it go. So there still are ongoing conversations.
Thank you for that. So I know we have about 4 minutes left. So one of the questions that got brought up earlier with Chair Howard was the difference between the House and Senate in the sense that the Senate has a lot of carve-outs in its bill. Are there specific carve-outs that you're going to be holding on to firmly as you go into negotiations? Do you think some of those carve-outs what is your position on some of those carve-outs?
Yeah, I think, we were pretty intentional with some of those, with those broadly, and those are there for a reason. However, I guess I would say, and I hesitate to speak for Chair Port, but my understanding and my perspective is that I think there's, we have to negotiate with the House. And so there's certainly opportunity for possibility for those to change.
Let's see, there's, I think I'll share the comments in the chat because we have 3 minutes. Can you just talk a little bit about, from your leadership perspective, and I think especially with this Metro sales tax and the conversation around dedicated revenue, Senator Dziedzic had been engaged with MHP on conversations related to dedicated revenue, our constitutional amendment effort, but she is struggling with her own health challenges. And so what does that absence mean, and how are some of these conversations moving forward in the absence of Senator Dziedzic?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So while she is, and first of all, I'll just say, all support sent to her. She's dealing with a lot, and certainly want to give her space and time to heal and recover and take care of herself. And I will say, she is very involved. She doesn't want to be, separated from the work that is happening, and she's not. So while she is not able to be physically here, she absolutely is, has a presence here in everything that we're doing. We are connected often. She is in conversations, with us as leaders every day. She is still, part of negotiations and driving decisions and part of meetings, and very much in the loop of what is happening and decisions that are being made. That being able to be connected is possible, even though she's not physically here. And I'm grateful for that. And, she's definitely still part of all of the ongoing conversations and decisions.
Well, great. That's great to hear, because she's been such a strong housing champion and has been engaged on dedicated revenue. Well, we have a minute left, so I just want to say thank you for popping in. I know our time with you was very brief, but really appreciate it. It was very informative. So thank you to everyone who joined us. We will be sending out a recording of this video. We will also be sending out slides, which I do have slides in the slide deck that go into more detail about comparing what's in the House, Senate, and the governor's proposal in terms of funding. So you can take a look at that and see the differences and the alignment as they go into conference committee. And feel free to reach out to me with any questions related to the recording, today's presentation, or anything that comes up as a result of the conversation that we had today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.